Hamada smiled when I entered the door, but I could tell that he was exhausted. As usual, he was sitting behind a worn-out wooden desk in a small pharmacy in the fringes of old Cairo, the sprawling lower-income neighborhood that covers large parts of the capital's southern perimeters. Dressed in a woolen jumper and a turtleneck shirt to protect against the winter wind, he was finalizing an order of supplies over the phone while simultaneously directing his assistant to the right packs of pills and syrups on the glass shelves covering the walls around him. A steady stream of visitors was calling for his attention, buying nappies, painkillers, tramadol, and hair gel, checking their blood pressure and asking El Doctor for all sorts of medical advice. In his early 30s, with 2 wives and 3 kids and 2 separate homes to support, Hamada was familiar with the routine. For the last 5 years, he had worked 5, 6, even 7 long days per week in the pharmacy. No holiday throughout this period had amounted to more than 4 or 5 days. After a few minutes, the customer cleared for the moment and we got a chance to talk. Hamada invited me to sit down on a chair next to him, and he asked his assistant to make us tea. In the previous months, Hamada had developed into an invaluable interlocutor and a good friend. An obsessive Zamalek supporter for more than 20 years, he was immensely knowledgeable about the sport's past and present. Whenever I had come to see him in the pharmacy, as well as when we had attended matches together at Cairo Stadium, he had taken pains to provide me with all the details and anecdotes I needed to know. This afternoon in early February 2012, however, both of us found it difficult to formulate thoughts and feelings. Since our last meetings about a week earlier, the stadium massacre in Port Said had taken place. The killing of 72 young football fans had unleashed clashes between protesters and security forces that were bringing central Cairo to a halt. Being a Zamalkawi and of a different generation than the Ultras, Hamada had no personal relation to anyone who had been present in Port Said. Nonetheless, as a devoted football supporter, the tragedy affected him profoundly. In face of the unfathomable that had befallen, we drank our tea in silence. Hamada fiddled with a piece of paper, his gaze remote and tired. For want of words, I came up with a suggestion. Perhaps he could finish early so we could watch the semi-final in the Africa Cup of Nations between Ghana and Zambia in a nearby coffee shop. Hamada's reaction was first one of slight confusion, but then he smiled at me, almost embarrassed, and said, and this is a quote, "I don't know, Carl, but honestly, until you said it, I didn't know that the semi-final was today, and I didn't know who was playing. It's strange, isn't it? Remember when you asked me about tournaments in the 1990s and 2000s? I knew all the games and all the players, everything, didn't I? I always watched every game and I remembered so many details about each tournament. I'm really good at that. And now I don't even know who is playing in the semi-final. It doesn't matter to me. I cannot think about football any longer. I'm sorry, it just doesn't feel right. Actually, the only one who discusses football with me these days is you."
Welcome to Middle East Center Book Talk, the Oxford podcast on new books about Middle East. These are books that are written sometimes by members of our community or else by books that we're talking about in our community at Oxford. My name is Walter Armbrust, and I teach social anthropology of the Middle East in the Middle East Studies program at the University of Oxford. Our speaker for this podcast is Carl Rommel. Carl did his PhD in anthropology at the School of Oriental and African Studies. I know him from having been his external examiner. He finished in 2015. Is that right? 2015?
15, yeah.
After which he had a postdoctoral fellowship for a year at the Zentrum Moderner Orient in Berlin, followed by a researcher position in a European Research Council-funded project at the University of Helsinki called Cross Locations, Rethinking Relative Locations in the Mediterranean. And the point of the project, as I understand it, is to understand changes in relations between people and locations in the Mediterranean region. And Carl's dissertation was an ethnography of Egyptian football, a topic that has been crying out for attention for about 50 years. He happens to have been researching the book during the revolution that began in 2011, but through through because of that, a great deal had to be said about the role of the football ultras in the revolution. But Carl's research goes much further than revolutionary politics, and a book based on the dissertation is now out, published by the University of Texas Press, and the title is Egypt's Football Revolution: Emotion, Masculinity, and Uneasy Politics. So, Carl, welcome to the Middle East Center community, at least virtually speaking. One day we hope to have you actually in our midst talking about your research face to face. So let me ask you first about writing the book. Tell us something about how the writing of your book proceeded. What made you want to write about football? I mean, it's almost a cliche to say that everyone in Egypt has to be either an Ahlawi or a Zamalekawi, a follower of one of the two most famous professional football clubs in Egypt. Was that truism about Ahli and Zamalek a starting point for the ethnography, or did you see it ultimately as an impediment to the ethnography? How did you go about formulating your research interests and getting into your field site?
Thank you first for inviting me. It's great to be here, Walter. So I think it was a little bit of a starting point. As many others, I came to Egypt first to study Arabic back in 2007 and 2008, and always been a big football fan, and I've always been watching football wherever I've been traveling. But it was something with football in Egypt that sort of caught my attention even more than in many other places. And it was this fact that football seemed to be absolutely everywhere in the street and always in urban space. So in all these cafes where people were watching the game, all over the media, it was almost difficult to have any type of conversation with people without touching on the topic. And then obviously this thing, Ahli Zamalek being these two big clubs, right? So when I, a couple of years later, wanted to set up a research project for a PhD, this was something I wanted to do something about, trying to sort of interrogate how this sort of world of football that seemed to be everywhere was creating, was sort of a baseline for creating some sort of everyday masculinity in Cairo. Now, what happened was that I started my PhD in late 2010, and just a few months later, of course, the revolution happened in January 2011. So, and after that, the field sort of transformed beyond recognition. So instead of studying this, when I came to Cairo for my actual fieldwork, so the main fieldwork for this book was happened between August 2011 and March 2013. Football was not at all this sort of everyday background noise that I sort of imagined it to be, or thought it was when I did my Arabic studies, but it was rather this extremely politicized thing that was at the same time everywhere. It was in the middle of the political transformation, but also disappearing, because people said that, oh, we used to like football in the past, but nowadays we don't really care that much about the game anymore. So instead of studying this thing that was just an everyday phenomenon, I'm starting to study this thing that was changing all the time. So the book is basically this story about a hugely important popular cultural phenomena, football in Egypt, that used to be extremely big, but then was sort of transforming and disappearing over time in tandem with the revolutionary transition. So it's in this sense, it's sort of a rise and fall story of football and how it's been taking all these political effects.
Your dissertation, you had quite a bit to say about the decade leading up to the revolution. And I'm assuming that probably that remains in the book. What was important about football in the decade leading up to the revolution?
So this is sort of the starting point for the book, and it's the first two chapters, which talk about football in the late Mubarak era. And I really start my narrative in the 1990s when Egypt reached the World Cup in Italy, the first World Cup since 1934. So it was quite a big event. But the main focus is on the last 5 years before the revolution, so say from 2006 until 2011, when Egypt was extremely successful. And this is the sort of the most obvious thing, that they won 3 consecutive Africa Cup of Nations, the national team. And Ahli was also very successful in the African Champions League. So what I'm trying to argue here is that there was this enormous football hype, unprecedented football hype in Egypt during this period. building up through the 90s and 2000s and being really sort of climaxing in the last years before 2011. And I'm trying to delineate why that happened and the different sort of components that came together in this big hype. And there was, on the one hand, new funding for football teams, semi-public football teams, like state institutions owning these teams, like the military, the police, oil companies owning football teams and channeling money into the game. There was a big rise of satellite television, which picked up Egyptian football and domestic football in particular very, very strongly. At one point in time, just before 2011, there was almost 10 different channels in Egypt only showing football. So like football only satellite television channels in Egypt. Football was also extremely present in popular culture, in pop songs and in the movies in this period. And then, of course, you had all these great results. You know, the Egyptian teams were so successful. And my argument in this, especially in the first chapter of the book, is that these things came together in this big, what I call a football bubble, that sort of encapsulated the nation and made football a very central feature of the national formation at the time. And it sort of delineated a way of being a normal Egyptian man, basically. So if you were a normal Egyptian man at the time, you had to sort of be a football fan, and you had to like football. You had to feel strongly for football. There's what is an emotional hype around the game. And what was, to cut a long story short, one of the most important things about this was also that the Mubarak family embodied this normal football guy who was not necessarily very intellectual, not particularly Muslim, but not too Muslim in this sort of Muslim Brotherhood sort of sense. So this normal football person, which was embodied by the Mubarak family, by Hosni Mubarak, but also by his two sons, Ala and Gamal. And this became a way for the ruling family to be one with the people in a very positive and optimistic and upbeat way, because the Egyptian teams were winning all the time. So it was a successful version of the Egyptian nation, which was very normalized and which the Mubarak family could tap into. And hence football became a very important part of the sort of soft power of the regime, I suppose.
Okay, so so the revolution begins in 2011 and goes on through 2012, and one of the claims that one constantly heard was that football ultras had played a key role in fighting against the security forces. And yet, by 2012, the general public was starting to become quite wary of the violence that was going on the street, and perhaps was blaming this on the same young men that were earlier sort of held up as kind of the loyal foot soldiers of the revolution, I guess. What's your take on that dynamic? What was your experience of interacting with ultras? I mean, how did they see their role in the revolution? And was the sort of public discourse about them accurate or revealing about something?
I think it's a great question. I'm spending like 3 chapters in the book trying to talk about the ultras' role in the revolution from many different angles. But I think this standard narrative about the ultras being very important, fighting back the police in Tahrir Square and Mohammed Mahmoud Street and these places, is accurate. They played an important role, and partly because they had an experience of fighting the police before 2011, because the ultras fans are this new type of football fans that evolved in Egypt from 2007 onwards, and much younger type of fans with a different type of fandom that was very much in opposition to the way Mubarak and the media was running their type of football at the time. And because of that, the police, they were ostracized by the media and also very much securitized and sort of persecuted by the police forces. So they had this experience of fighting the police before 2011, which they then took on into the streets and became an important part of the revolutionary transformation in 2011. Now, what I'm trying to do in this book is also to say that the revolution of the ultras was bigger than that. It was also, which I just mentioned, a way of challenging the way the emotional political bubble that football had constituted during the Mubarak era. So if Mubarak had used football in one way, to stake out a version of the nation that was very suitable for him and his regime, the ultras had a very different way of engaging emotionally with the game from 2007 onwards. That was more internationally oriented, more younger, more do-it-yourself, not so dependent on the media, more about like doing your own flags and chants and songs and dance at the stadium, very much stadium focused instead of media focused, very much focused on social media rather than satellite television. It was a totally different football universe that was sort of challenging the way in which football had been mediatized and supported and picked up by the regime and by establishment actors in the run up to the revolution. So Egypt's football revolution that I'm talking about, the title of the book, is a bigger thing than just the ultras fighting the police in the streets, even though that was part of the thing as well. It was also this emotional challenge, a totally different style of being a football fan that also staked out a different way of being an Egyptian national man, I suppose, that then came to overtake Mubarak's football nation during the revolutionary year.
I wanted to ask you about emotion. The book, is brilliant at sort of dissecting the politics of Egyptian football, but the politics are refracted through masculinity and emotion, which are mentioned in the title of the book. Why emotion? I mean, what caused you to make that kind of the thing that helped to kind of distribute and organize politics?
For several reasons. First of all, I think it's I think, as I just said about what was happening during the Mubarak era, the way in which why football became so powerful as this vehicle to stake out a version of the nation that was so useful and beneficial for the Mubarak regime, was also because it is such an emotionally attractive thing. It also draws a lot of people to it, right? So it's obvious that football becomes this powerful vehicle for mobilization because it's such an emotional thing that draws people into this world. But I also think there is something, and the way in which it delineates the way of being an Egyptian citizen, an Egyptian man, is through not only making people talk and behave in certain ways, but also feel in certain ways for the nation. And I'm picking up a lot of Anne Stoller's work on affective states, affect and emotion. I'm delineating a little bit about between the two concepts in the book, but not so much necessarily. And I'm saying both that the football is very powerful, and in the Egyptian case especially, to create this sort of affective state of defining how people should feel for football and also for the nation. But that is also always a volatile type of politics, because you cannot never really control emotions. You cannot really. They're very powerful, but also always fragile in a way. Right?
Although presumably the normative construct of masculinity, kind of demands the suppression of emotion.
True. That's maybe the stereotype about that. But I for me, this is. In case of football, it's definitely not the case. You're supposed to feel very strongly for the football team, and the ultras are all about like creating strong emotional performances, strong emotional communities at the stadium. That's what it's all about. That's why it's so. Otherwise, it would never have drawn in hundreds of thousands of young kids in Egypt to this thing if it wasn't fun. This is the main thing. All people, my interlocutors, my ultras friends, they always talk about how that this is. The best thing, the thing they love the most to do, to stand there at the stadium.
Well, no, that actually leads to the next question I wanted to ask you, which is, I mean, in a way, to kind of to force football into the mold of politics, kind of kills it in a way. I mean, it's a game that people love, it's a game that people enjoy, and this perhaps kind of is a way to kind of gesture towards where your book leads in the end. Because I know that you're aware of this from having read your dissertation, and so the joy of the game. Did that eventually transcend the politics? Did it sort of merge with the politics?
No,
Do people still love playing football? And where did the politics of the revolutionary period end
yeah,
up?
that's probably the final part of the title, right? So Egypt's football revolution, emotion, masculinity, and uneasy politics, right? So one thing that is popping up in several chapters in the book, and which wasn't really that highlighted in this dissertation, but much more emphasized now in the book version, in the book, is this way in which, uh, well, as this passage that I read initially hints at, and this is part of a chapter when I talk a lot about how fans who used to be extremely invested in football, extremely passionate about the game, lost their interest and their passions and their feelings for football, especially after this very tragic stadium massacre of 72 Ultras fans in Port Said on the 1st of February 2012. This is a process that had been going on for a while already before that, but after that it became widespread. A lot of people felt that we cannot really care about this sport anymore, partly because so many people have died, but the way they formulated it, and this is the important thing, is because the game has been politicized. It's been entangled with politics, siyasa, in Arabic, right? So here you have the problem that when it became articulated that football had been politicized, and this started to happen slightly before 2011, but then became accentuated and much more widespread in 2011 and 2012. It became more and more difficult for people to feel and care about the game, because there was some sort of tension between, on the one hand, football being this space of joy and freedom and pleasure, and politics, which had all these uneasy connotations of uncertainty, of violence, of seriousness, I suppose, which made it difficult for a lot of people to feel for the game. And I'm trying to delineate that through an ethnographic study of discussions, debates, but also experiences of siyasa, politics in Egypt, and how people talk about it and also feel politics in different ways, and how that it's always sort of connoting these feelings of unease and anxieties in many different ways, and how that has led over time to football becoming more and more difficult to feel for and care for in the way people did before 2011. And as I say in the postscript, which deals with the last 2 years, 2018 and 2019, when Egypt reached the World Cup in 2018 and hosted the African Cup of Nations 2019, this anxiety, this ambivalence is still there, even though Mohamed Salah, the new big football superstar, is the best player ever. Egypt has reached the World Cup, which they didn't do during the Mubarak era, especially except for 1990. There was still not at all the same type of hype around the game. And part of that was because a lot of fans felt that they had realized after revolution, they had been sort of fooled by this big football hype, and they didn't want that to be recreated. So there was always an anxiety. It's like, do we really want to wholeheartedly support this football team again? There's a risk, right, of getting back to the same politicization that they had sort of been managed to get away from during the revolutionary era. So there is this anxiety that I'm trying to delineate in the book, in several chapters.
Mm-hmm. Two more linked questions. First of all, are you continuing to do research on football specifically, or are you moving into new directions? And secondly, if one were, your book was brilliant. I mean, it's a brilliant book based on a brilliant dissertation, which I loved reading. But is it the last word on football? If one were to continue if somebody else were to do research on football, what would you want them? What would you tell them to look at?
This is a good question. I'm sort of still doing it, but in a slightly different way. I'm looking more at youth football and the way in which sort of everyday football. I'm sort of back to this everyday football thing that I was sort of starting out with before the revolution struck, and looking at the emergence of these small new football pitches all over Cairo, and but more from sort of investor perspective rather than actually the game itself. I think. Yeah, it's a good question. there are several obvious options. There's this, I'm also looking at that a little bit in the paper I'm writing at the moment about the sort of religious connotations around the game, the sort of this blatant fact that a lot of people have been mentioning but never really understood, that there are absolutely very few Christian Egyptians who have been representing, like there's been one Egyptian player ever in the national team over more than 100 years. So this is something, there is something there with the way in which football is coded as Muslim, but also about obviously some sort of discrimination at many multiple levels that makes.
I'm assuming in real life Christian kids play football as much as Muslim kids.
Absolutely, they do, but for some reason they never really reach the top, and that's something that could be, I don't know, looked at somehow if it's possible. I'm not really sure. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure what, like in terms of fan culture, the ultras are not really there anymore. Ultras Ahlawi, the biggest ultras group, was dissolved in 2018, so they just don't exist. Ultras White Knights, which is the ultras supporting Zamalek, the second biggest club in Cairo, they're still around, but they're quite inactive. So that's sort of the thing that I've been writing about the politicization of the game and all that seems to be sort of disappearing. A lot of that. Although, of course, this at the same time, this hesitancy for football to come back, it will wane with time. It will disappear. I'm sure football will come back and be enormously popular. It is enormously popular in Egypt today. Yeah,
as it is everywhere.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to say?
No, maybe also mention that this unease, this anxieties about politics, siyasa, is something that pops up also in the ultras chapters all the time, where I'm running an argument about, or I'm showing through my material that the ultras were constantly accused by the media for being political. Okay, so that was one of the main ways in which they were demonized by the media and by the establishment actors, that they were trying to, when they were trying to revolutionize Egyptian football, they were always considered political, meaning that they were fighting for their own specific demands, their own specific, not for the nation as a whole, right? At the same time, the ultras constantly tried to say, we are not political, either by saying, okay, we are only football fans, we're not into politics, or by saying that we are pure nationalists as everyone else. We are fighting for the cause, for the good of the whole people, for the entire Egyptian people. For a moment when the ultras managed to stay very strong and have a very strong say in Egyptian politics and in the revolutionary transition, they managed to pull off this sort of balancing act between being a very forceful force and doing a lot of things and running campaigns for change and justice and everything without looking political. But in the end, they lost that ability for a number of reasons that I outlined.
Yeah. Which was remarkable. It was remarkable because prior to the revolution, I mean, ultras would be the sort of people that many middle-class people would fear. There was a movie that was in the theater just before the revolution came out called 678, which is about sexual harassment, in which one of the female characters is raped in the aftermath of a football match by...
I mentioned that in one chapter, yeah.
Ultras, like people who kind of look a little bit like they're serious fans, like ultras, perhaps. So it was indeed a very interesting balancing act that they were able to achieve during the revolution.
There was for a year there was this exceptional moment when they somehow tried to be both very active and very forward-looking and like doing all these things and affecting all this change without looking political. But then they somehow lost that ability, and then they sort of also became very marginalized from the revolutionary struggle. And I'm sort of making an argument in a conclusion that this might be something that we might want to consider for the revolutionary moment as a whole in Egypt, that there was always this assumption that the revolution should be nationalist for the whole people and not really political in that sense of being for a faction or for a certain class or something. And that it might not be very easy to carry out a revolutionary change if you want to stay non-political at the same time.
Yeah, and I know that you and other researchers are doing work on the kind of the post-revolution, and sort of how people deal with the with the letdown from a revolution that was defeated. And for the ultras, I guess the revolution was their shining moment, and the letdown must have been particularly hard.
Very much so, and a lot of the leaders are either in prison or abroad. A lot of people are not living in Egypt anymore, or moving on to some other type of career. People are growing older as well. Most of these people were in their early 20s at the time. Now they're in their early 30s, and
Yeah. Well, I think on that rather sad note, we're going to have to end.
Yeah.
It's been wonderful talking to you. I love your station. I will enjoy reading the book, which I suspect is quite similar to the dissertation, which was I have to say, one of the best ones I've read. I've been speaking with author Carl Rommel about his book, Egypt's Football Revolution, Emotion, Masculinity, and Uneasy Politics. And this has been Middle East Center Book Talk. Thank you for listening, and goodbye from Oxford.